Early Sanskrit fiction had a lot of robot stories, and so many that, according to Signe Cohen, who's a professor on the subject, Sanskrit robot tales are extensive enough to be considered a genre in themselves. She mentions that I am actually searching for a better education, and it turns out she used to study at Valmiki's ashram. But now she says that Valmiki is busy composing the Ramayana, and the rest of the time he is spending with love and kush. So we other students are not benefiting that much. If you look at the current number system, they are called Arabic numerals, but the Arabs themselves call them Hindu numerals because when they were translating our texts, Al-Khwarizmi actually called his book On Computation Using Hindu Numerals. Of course, later the West forgot to give us credit for this. The Paninian grammar is very famous for being very precise and exact, just like algorithms. So it's very suitable for computers or for AI to understand. Now, the second reason is that in Sanskrit, the position of words in a sentence does not change the meanings.
Namaste. Imagine a language that is even more older than several of the empires. A language in which several of the literatures, poems, a lot more literary sources has been written. And today it stands in front of us as a core language of the artificial intelligence, computational sciences. Today with us is Dr. Brishti Guha, who is with us at the Sangam Talks to talk about Sanskrit, about the legacy of the language, about its evolution, and about its transition from the ancient scripture as to how it algorithmically is in front of us as the language of the AI. Welcome to Sangam Talks, ma'am.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Yeah, great to be back. And as we know, your previous talk was really a success and it has been received very well from the audience. So, what are the feedbacks which you got from them?
It's great, really. Everybody is enjoying it, and I'm also very happy about that.
So, ma'am, today we are here to discuss about Sanskrit. So, when we say Sanskrit, many think it's an old language, it's an outdated language. But as a professor, as an academician, how do you see the language of Sanskrit from the modern perspective?
Okay, so I think Sanskrit has a lot of current relevance, and I will approach this question by talking about its relevance in three aspects. I'll talk about literature, history, and the history of science, and also some modern day applications. So let's delve straight into literature. Okay, so anyone who loves a good story would actually do well to explore Sanskrit literature because Sanskrit has a wealth of plays, poems, and novels with great storylines. So they are very eventful. So let me give a few examples of that. So one is Dashakumar Charitam. This is a Sanskrit novel written in the 7th century by Dandin. Now, Dandin lived in Kanchipuram and he traveled all over India. So, this comes through in his novel where he's vividly described urban life in a number of cities across ancient India. Now, what is this novel about? So, Dashakumar Charitam means the adventures of 10 young men. So, this is an out and out adventure novel and it's about 10 friends. So, these friends, they don't have any money but they have received some very interesting training. Okay, so in addition to learning about academics and in addition to learning fighting skills, they also have learned some very practical things. For example, they know all about poisons, they know about medicinal herbs, they know how to break into a house, they know how to perform magic tricks. Okay, so what happens in this novel is that they set out to make their own fortunes and then each of them separates. So they decide we'll meet back here at some specified time and then they do that and they all share their adventures during this period. So each friend narrates his own story and this is the framework of the novel. So this novel has everything. Okay, so I mentioned they are trying to make their own fortunes. So they do that, they become very rich and successful. Some of them actually get kingdoms for themselves. Now, when they get kingdoms, they also marry beautiful princesses. So, romance is a big part of the story. Now, in addition, many of them don't know their birth parents, they have been separated from them. So, in the course of the novel, they end up being reunited with their real families. So, that's a nice twist to the novel. And there are, of course, lots of fights, including fights with sea pirates. And there's even politics. For example, one of the friends becomes the political advisor to a king, and he actually sends agents to an enemy kingdom to try and manipulate public opinion there. Okay, so this is Dashakumar Charitam. Now I'll quickly talk about a couple of plays. So the first one is Mudra Rakshasa, which means the signet ring of Rakshasa. This was written by Vishak Datta in the 8th century, and this is a political drama. So the protagonist here is Chanakya. Now, Chandragupta Maurya had just become the king in this play, and he was not very strong as yet. And Rakshasa was the name of the person who had been the minister of the Nanda dynasty. Now, Chandragupta Maurya had actually replaced this Nanda dynasty. So, Rakshasa was not positively inclined towards Chandragupta. But Chanakya wanted to win over Rakshasa to their side. So, the entire play is about this. And through the play, we get a fascinating glimpse into a whole world of spies, double agents, hired assassins, how to strategically play off political alliances against each other, and even how to hire poets to create public opinion. Okay, then the other one I'll mention is Mrichakatikam, which means little clay cart. So this is much older than the other two. It was written around the 1st century AD by Shudrak. Okay, now this is a time period when the Shakas were coming into India. So Shakas had occupied some parts of India. So you can see that that play is quite anti-Shaka in sentiment. Okay, so this is mainly a romance, but there are some very interesting characters. Like there are unlucky gamblers, there are clever thieves, there is somebody who stages a coup, then a murder happens, which is done by a foreigner who's a Shaka, and then it becomes a court drama. So there's suspense. So again, a little bit of everything.
That's really nice. So from like espionage thrillers uh, to courtroom dramas, Sanskrit seems to be having so many things which usually in modern perspective we credit to the Western literature. But why is it that Sanskrit is so overlooked that we say that whatever good comes, it comes from the West, and we don't see within India, within Bharat, that is within Sanskrit literature, for such genres like thrillers or like dramas, such things. So why is it overlooked?
Okay, so this is due to a British conspiracy, and for this we have to go to the English Education Act of 1835. Now, this act was pushed forward by Macaulay, and basically what the act did is that it shut down all Sanskrit schools. So it completely stopped indigenous education. It also banned printing of Sanskrit books. And Macaulay was basically trying to give a reason or to justify this act. So he wrote a minute to this act. And there he said very derogatory things about knowledge in India and about Sanskrit. For example, he said that one single shelf of English books has more value than the entire native literature of India and Arabia. Okay, he also said that in a nursery school in England, more knowledge is imparted than what is there in the entire corpus of Sanskrit texts. So, the reason he was saying these things is that he was trying to justify greater intervention and rule by the British, because what he said is we are a superior civilization. It is our duty to rule over these poor, ignorant natives and teach them. And the problem is that this had a great effect on Indians also, because Indians bought into this, and they, because they could not then even access Sanskrit literature since printing had been stopped, it had been stopped, schools which were teaching Sanskrit had been shut down. So they actually started believing the British propaganda, and they thought that we are inferior to the British. Okay, so and it went further because Macaulay wrote some private letters to his father, which you can look up in the collected letters of Thomas Macaulay. And here he was saying that I think this English education plan is working very well because I observe that Hindus who are learning English education are becoming less and less attached to their religion. And he even said, I hope and pray that within 30 years, idol worship will disappear from Bengal. So, of course, it did not happen to that extent, but maybe it worked to some extent, which would explain why some Hindus even now are anti Hindu. They feel embarrassed about their religion.
You throw some light upon the Western perspective or the British conspiracy to severely undermine the Indian corpus of literature, of literary sources. And this has happened not only with Sanskrit sources but also with the regional languages, be it Tamil, be it Telugu, be it Kannada, be it Malayalam, and also several other dialects with which even folklore is also involved. So it makes sense how the British conspiracy, in overall sense, try to severely undermine the literary sources of India, and maybe that is the reason why we are even now overlooking it.
Yeah.
So at this moment, I want to ask you one literary sources from Sanskrit, which actually overturned your perspective about Sanskrit, and which felt so interesting for you that it actually motivated you to go about and start seeking knowledge from Sanskrit.
Okay, so some of us think that genres like science fiction and robot stories are pretty recent, and we think they came from the West. For example, we might think of as Isaac Asimov.
Is it robot stories?
Yes. Wow. So Isaac Asimov was writing in the 20th century, so we would usually think of him. But it turns out that early Sanskrit fiction had a lot of robot stories, and so many that, according to Signe Cohen, who's a professor on the subject, Sanskrit robot tales are extensive enough to be considered a genre in themselves. So I'll tell you a little bit about one such story. So this is from the Loka Pragyapti, which is a Sanskrit text. And here what happens is there was a real historical king named Ajatashatru.
Yeah.
Right? So Ajatashatru at some point, he became a follower of the Buddha. And then Buddha dies and Ajatashatru collects some relics from Buddha's body. So then he decides, I must hide these relics and I must keep them safe. So he builds a shrine and he keeps the relics there. But then he has a problem. He says, who will guard these relics? I don't want human guards. Okay, because he wanted somebody to keep on guarding the relics even after he dies. And he also thought if there are human guards, they can disclose the location. Okay, so then he searches and he actually finds someone within his own city who's making robots. Okay, and this person helps him to make robots, and the robots guard the shrine. And the thing is that they have an inbuilt sensor. So when somebody approaches them, these robots start spinning in the air and they have swords. So then if someone tries to come in, they would cut off the head of that person. Okay, so the history of this robot maker is also interesting because what they say is that his father had gone to Rome, and then the father married the daughter of the chief of Roman robot guild. Okay, so they were making robots in Rome, and this person, he learned from them, the Indian person, and then he had a son. So then the father and the son came back to India. Now Rome actually sent a robot after them to kill them because they said, oh no, somebody is taking our secrets to India. Now they will make robots in India. So the father gets killed, but the son survives. So then the son has started making robots here. And so then what happens is after he makes those robots for the shrine, 200 or 300 years pass. Okay, then Emperor Ashoka appears. So Ashoka, as you know, he also converted to Buddhism. And then he had heard of these relics of the Buddha. So he wanted to distribute them among the public. Then he found the shrine but he found it's barred by robots, so I cannot get in. So then he finds another descendant of that same robot making family, and he gets his help, so they disarm the robots, and then this person additionally helps Ashoka to start building an army of robots. Now what happens is Rome again gets to know Ashoka is building an army of robots, and they get very scared. So what they do is they send a diplomat, and the diplomat is carrying a gift for Ashoka, and within the gift a robot is actually hidden. The robot is supposed to kill Ashoka, but luckily this robot maker, he suspects something, so he opens the gift, so he gets killed, Ashoka gets saved. Okay, so the reason this completely changed my perspective is, first of all, of course, it's about robots, but it also, ties it with real people.
It's not 100% fiction, but
Yes.
it has a realistic perspective. So it makes you believe that no, something that is associated with history has also something to do with literary and fiction.
Yes, exactly. And also in modern robot stories, one fear is that because robots have some capacity, they can go rogue and they can start attacking the people who made them. And this happens in this same story. Twice robots kill the people who made them.
That's interesting. The literary fiction is something that is, and for me personally, it has attracted me also to read more about Sanskrit literature. But one thing that has even attracted me even more is are the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Puranas, or the Itihas, which still has relevance. Relevance from the perspective of dharma, science, philosophy, or ethics, you can say. So, as a researcher, as an academician, how do you see these things when it comes to the literary legacy of Sanskrit? From the perspective of dharma, philosophy, ethics, etc., etc.
Okay, so let me come to the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which are our epics, and they're also called Itihasa. Okay, so they are among the best of the world's literature, and they have such characters and such situations that we, even today, we can easily identify with them. Okay, for example, the dilemma which Arjuna faced on the battlefield, that should he take the side of right, and should he fight this war, or should he hold back because his relatives, his teacher, his friends are on the other side. Okay, so one interesting feature about the epics is that they actually inspired a lot of later Sanskrit literature. So people would take, say, one character in the epics or one situation, and they would expand it into a full length play or a story. And for example, they would even change the ending to something which they prefer. For example, in a play of Bhasa, he stops the Kurukshetra war, so the war does not happen. Yeah, in a
So
play.
it's fiction again.
It's fiction again. Then similarly, in a play by Bhavabhuti, the end is happy. Ram, Sita, and the two children, they all get united. So they live happily ever after. Okay, so and the funny thing is, it's still doing the same thing today. So if you look at the whole collection of Indian mythological fiction written in English, most of it is retellings of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. So there is this continuity.
So, one thing which we see is that the Sanskrit literary source, it's always associated with the politics of that day, society of that day, the cultural aspects, or what the human practices were of that day. So, what do we learn through these ancient literary sources about the about the society of those days, about the politics of those days, about the dharma or dharmic perspective of those days, spiritual practices of those days? What are they that we get about these things in the Sanskrit sources, which we usually don't get in the English translations or in the colonial perspectives or narratives? What are they?
Okay, so now I'm coming to how Sanskrit tells us about what our own society was like in the past. So I will start off with the Rig Veda. Now, when we think of the Rig Veda, we usually don't think of history. We think of it as a source of some sacred prayers or chants. but we actually get to know a huge amount from the Rig Veda itself. For example, it comes with an Anukramani. Now, this Anukramani is a list of the names of composers of individual hymns, and there are at least 20 women in this list. Okay, the same list is replicated in other places like the Brihad Devata. So, what this immediately tells us is that women were highly educated in the Vedic age, because it's not even enough to be literate, you have to be capable of writing poetry, and the poetry has to be of extremely high quality, otherwise, it will never be included in the Rig Veda. Now, this is something which shocked Western Indologists like Witzel, because the situation of women's education was very different in ancient Western societies like Greece or Rome. Okay, so now, if we come to the content of the Rig Veda, that actually gives us a snapshot of what the society was like, and it was a pretty open and non judgmental society. For example, the caste system was not entrenched, it was not associated with occupation. So, there is a Rigvedic hymn where the poet is saying that he, his father, and his mother all have different occupations and they are all living together happily. So it immediately just note two things. First is his mother has an occupation. Okay. And the second thing is, at least the poet and his father are of the same caste, but they have different occupations. So the reason I said at least he and his father, because his mother could have had a different caste, since intercaste marriages were so common up to, I think, after the AD era started, right? That they even had specific names for mixed castes, where the parents are of different castes. And we also learn about the position of women from the content. So what we learn is that women had a lot of freedom. They could always enter into relationships. They could choose the person they're going to marry, and widows could also remarry. So we know this from a funeral hymn 10.18, where a woman has just been widowed and she is very depressed. She is lying down on the ground beside the place where her husband is going to be buried. And all the people come to her and they lift her up and they say, celebrate the fact that you are among the living. And they're actually very nice. So they say, we are going to ensure that we all stay together till old age. We will live happily together and we will live a life full of laughter, good food, songs. Okay, and you should be part of it. And they even tell her there is this man who is willing to take your hand and become your second husband. Okay, so the word for second husband is didhishu. Now this brings me to a very important point which you made, that sometimes translations, miss out on very important things. So in this funeral hymn itself, the entire meaning was distorted because of a mistranslation. Yeah, so there is a word in the hymn, Sanskrit word agre, which means to go forward. Okay, now the main English translator, H.T. Colebrook, he thought that it's Agne and he mistranslated Agne as well. So he thought this is the Saptami Ekvachan of Agni. So he said into the fire. And whereas it's actually not the Saptami Ekvachan of Agni is Agno. So it could not, even if it had been Agni, it would not have meant into the fire. So on this basis, what happened is that the British as well as all the Indian readers who read that translation, they started associating it with Sati. Okay, and because they thought the widow has been pushed into the fire. And then, people thought that, Sati was there in Vedic times, it's sanctioned by the Veda. The entire narrative is false and based on a mistranslation. So, this shows us that it's very important for us to actually go to the original Sanskrit sources, for which we need to learn Sanskrit. Okay, and there are some, so coming to other things we get to know from the Rig Veda, one point is about the rishis. Okay, so we normally think that rishis like Vashisht or Vishwamitra are mythical. And the reason we think so is that no matter what story we look at, whatever time period it's set in, Vashisht is always there. Vishwamitra is always there. So we begin thinking, how can a real person live for so long? You know, But the Rigved even provides an explanation for that, because 6 of the 10 books of the Rigveda are what are known as family books. Now, each family book is written or composed by a separate family of rishis. For example, the Vashishta family, Vishwamitra family, Angirasas, Kanvas, and a few others. So, what this immediately tells us is Vashishta is not a person's name, it is actually what we now call a surname. And we can get the names of the individual composers from that family if we look at the Anukramani. So, this immediately tells us that these people are not mythical, because it wasn't that one person lived forever. There are many separate people from the same family. So, we can take rishis now, we can demystify them, and we can start seeing them as real people, as part of history rather than as part of myth.
No, even sometimes the fiction part is so realistic, because maybe the because of the blending with the real history, that you keep thinking whether this is fiction or history, or historical fiction, or historical something else, right?
But you see, like the Vedas, for example, they're not really
Yeah.
fiction.
Yeah, not fiction.
It's
Definitely
like,
not fiction.
you know, what kind of picture do you get of society from that? So here I'll also come to another picture we get from a play by Bhavabhuti named Uttar Ramacharita. So there are two minor female characters here, Atreyi and Vasanti, and they meet by chance when Atreyi is traveling to the south, and she mentions that I am actually searching for a better education. And it turns out she used to study at Valmiki's ashram. But now she says that Valmiki is busy composing the Ramayana, and the rest of the time he is spending with love and kush. So we other students are not benefiting that much. So then she says, I am going to the south. Hopefully, you know, I can enter some other Gurukul, such as, you know, that run by Agastya. And this shows us that women were so serious about their education, because remember, she's making this very long journey on foot, and she's going through hundreds of miles of forested land. She can be attacked by robbers, she can be attacked by wild animals. Okay, but she still thinks it's worth it. And even the other character says, yeah, it makes sense. You know, and now your point about fiction also comes in, because we could say that how do we know that in the real world people had the same attitude? So here I would say that because this is a playwright will never put anything into a play which the theatre going public will not accept, because then the play will be a flop. Yeah, so the fact that Bhavabhuti put it into a play means that he thought it will be acceptable to the audience.
So, pinpointing on Sanskrit, we can say that it's a never-ending track wherein anything and everything can travel together in terms of expressing its viewpoints, be it poetry, be it literature, be it arts, be it classics, be it Vedas, Puranas, Upanishads. So anything that is associated with society, the politics, or the history of those days, it always found a everlasting medium in Sanskrit to find us. When it comes to expression of religion, expression of dharma, Sanatana dharma, we see that Buddhism and Jainism, they both have also had influence on Sanskrit literature, and definitely Sanskrit was also having influence on Buddhism and Jainism in its propagation, in its spreading of voices and all. So, how do you see the evolution of Buddhism and Jainism from the perspective of Sanskrit literature?
Okay. So, yeah, people think Sanskrit is only associated with Hinduism, but actually, a lot of Buddhist and Jain literature is also written in Sanskrit. And in fact, the best biography of the Buddha is written in Sanskrit by Ashwaghosha around the 2nd century BC, and it's called the Buddha Charita. And Buddhists and Jains were always freely debating with other philosophers who were broadly within the Hindu school. So even within the Hindu school, there was so much diversity, because there were both Astic and Nastic schools. And then these Astic, Nastic schools, Buddhists, Jains, everyone was harmoniously debating together. And in fact, that led to a lot of new knowledge. You know, for example, You must have heard of Indian logic, which is called Nyaya. Okay, so I would say that both Hindus and Buddhists collectively developed Nyaya to its a very refined level. For example, one canonical text of Nyaya is the Nyaya Sutra of Akshapad Gautama, who was a Hindu. Now, that laid the foundations for everything, but later on, there were Buddhist logicians like Dignaga who were very famous. So, they developed that field of study further. So, and even if you get to the whole collection of philosophical texts, for example, there is a survey of many of our ancient philosophies in the Sarva Darshana Sangraha written by Madhava. So, here they actually start with Jainism.
So let's talk about science.
Yes.
Today, it's a fact that how Indian science traveled all the way to Europe and how it was resold back to us saying it's European science. But even before that, if we see Nyaya, Vaisheshika philosophy, if we see other treatises that are scientifically relevant even today, when it comes to the works of Aryabhatta, Bhaskara, etc., we see scientific activities happening through the Vedas and Upanishads also, though it has a linkage with spirituality, consciousness, etc. But coming to the core aspects of science, what influence has Sanskrit had on the development of science and scientists of those days?
Okay, so let me first talk a little bit about mathematics and astronomy. Okay, so one thing which India is famous for is zero. Now, of course, it's not enough just to have zero as a mathematical symbol. You have to look into the mathematical properties of zero integrated into the number line and find out how to do arithmetical operations with it. So, all this was done by Brahmagupta in his book, the Brahmasputa Siddhanta, which means the opening of the universe. So, this book was quickly taken to Baghdad where it was translated, and then it was, it spread from Arabia to the west, to Europe. So, the Arabic word for zero was cipher. Now, what happened later is that in the Italian town of Florence, zero was actually banned. Okay, why? Because people were always adding a zero to accounts and they were distorting them. So what happened after this is people were very upset. They said we want to keep using zero. So they started using zero secretly and so that the government can't find out. So this actually links the word cipher, which also means secret code, with the Arabic word cipher, which is for zero.
That's a fact.
Yeah. And then, another very famous result, which actually we had originally come up with, is what the so called Pythagoras theorem. So, this actually appears in the Bodhayana Sulba Sutra. This is conventionally dated to 800 BC, which is a few centuries before Pythagoras. And here I'll very briefly mention that this is a part of several Vedic geometric texts. Okay, Sulba means rope. A lot of measurements were done using rope. Okay, now next, we also came up with the present system of numbers which are used all over the world, and the positional place value notation, which means there is a separate place for units, is a tens place, hundreds place, etc. Current number system, they are called Arabic numerals, but the Arabs themselves call them Hindu numerals because when they were translating our texts, Al-Khwarizmi actually called his book On Computation Using Hindu Numerals. Of course, later the West forgot to give us credit for this. Okay, now about the positional place value system, it's actually very important for computation because if you think of the system in ancient Greece, they did not have this. So, what they needed to do, suppose they are trying to do a subtraction in the marketplace, they will first have to draw a geometrical figure whose area is equal to one number. Then they have to draw a second figure whose area is equal to the second number, and they have to subtract one area from the other. Okay, and it's even worse with Roman numerals. So anybody who knows Roman numerals knows that they had so many digits and the number of digits had no correlation with the size of the number. Okay, so this place value system actually appears in the Bakshali manuscript, which was found in northwest India.
Near Peshawar,
Yeah,
modern day Peshawar.
yes. So we can also show a page from the Bakshali manuscript. And this basically is interesting for other reasons also, because the area where it was found was basically a trade route. Okay, so all the math problems are about travelers and traders. They are trying to exchange camels and horses. So it shows that we are trying to translate math to real life contexts and problems. Okay, then another concept which we came up with is negative numbers. Now, in modern times, it may not seem that big a deal, but if you think about ancient societies, well, of course, ancient people would want to start counting things, but for that, positive numbers are enough. In fact, how do you conceptualize something which is not even there? So, Brahmagupta actually provided a very nice intuition for negative numbers. He called them rinam or debts. Okay, so you can immediately see that for a businessman, the debts translate into negative assets or liabilities. Okay, then we also laid the foundation for modern trigonometry through Aryabhatta's sine and cosine tables. In addition, we were very skilled at algebra. So this Bakshali manuscript that I referred to, it has linear and quadratic equations, while Aryabhatta's work has quadratic and indeterminate equations. And Brahmagupta and the later mathematician Bhaskara too, they did very groundbreaking work on what later became known as Pell's equation. Now, most of you would also have heard of the Fibonacci series or Pascal's triangle. Now, you would be surprised to know that very many centuries before them, actually in the 2nd century BC, Pingala had come up with them. So who was Pingala? Okay, Pingala was actually a prosodist, which means his field of study was poetical meter. So he also came up with permutations and combinations. So how come someone who's studying meter comes up with so many mathematical results? Okay, so poets at that time were facing a problem. They said that suppose we have a line of poetry with a certain given number of syllables, how many combinations of short and long sounds we can use in that line. So to solve this problem, Pingala came up with the concept of permutations and combinations, and then the other results followed from this. Okay, finally, I will also mention the Kerala school of mathematics, where Madhava and his followers explored infinite series in great detail. And infinite series actually lays the groundwork for calculus, for which Newton and Leibniz received credit, but they came many centuries after Madhava. Okay, so a little bit more also I'll mention.
Please.
So yeah, so this is a page from the Leelavati. Now the Leelavati is
By
a,
Bhaskaracharya.
yeah, it's a maths text written by Bhaskaracharya in the 12th century, and it was the primary math textbook in Indian schools for the next 700 years. After that, of course, the British shut down all these schools. Okay, and it's unique because all the problems here are actually addressed to young girls. Okay, and here is on this page there is some text with a problem from the Leelavati and also an illustration. So you can see there is a pillar, there's a peacock at the top of the pillar, there's a snake at the foot of the pillar, and the problem is about their paths of motion and where they will meet. Okay, and now a little bit about astronomy. So, you know, Aryabhatta, of course, he's famous for things like calculating the value of pi very accurately, but he was also a very good astronomer. So, he talks about things like the Earth's rotation, the fact that different parts of the world had different times of the day or night. He talks about the causes of eclipses, and very importantly, he finds out just using maths that the orbits of planets around the sun were elliptical. Now, this is something which he could not observe because telescopes were not available back then. But 1200 years after Aryabhatta, Kepler verified it through a telescope. He found that the orbits are actually elliptical, And this is something which Aryabhatta had worked out 1200 years before Kepler just using maths. Okay, now the tradition of astronomy in India is actually even, it's much older than Aryabhatta. So now we have found work by some archaic astronomers like Parashar and Vriddhagarga who are dated to 1400 BC. And even they had access to 1300 years of observations before them. So observations of the night sky, planets, comets, etc. So this means that at least from 2700 BC, we had a tradition of observational astronomy. Now, even in between these very old astronomers and Aryabhatta, there were other astronomers. So these are known as pre-Siddhantic astronomers. And they could do things like predict when an eclipse is going to happen and what the duration of the eclipse will be. And some of their works are actually collected later by Varahamihir in the Pancha Siddhantika. But Varahamihir says this is not my own work. This is the work of much earlier astronomers.
So a lot of innovation and innovative thinking has gone into into creation of theories, creation of scientific invention, innovation, discoveries. So in this sense, in this perspective, how has Sanskrit contributed into innovative thinking process? What are the treatises, if any? What are the philosophies? What are the methodologies that Sanskrit has to offer, wherein the Sanskritic or the scientific thinking process became innovative or innovation oriented or discovery oriented?
Okay, so I would say that all of these texts show that there's a spirit of innovation. They were always trying to improve. But if I have to mention one text which is extraordinarily innovative, it's the Samar Angana Sutradhara, which was written by King Bhoj, okay, in the early 11th century. So because it has, so some of it is about things like temple architecture, painting and sculpture, but the very innovative parts of it, one part is about robots. Okay, so it's not just fiction, right? So he talks about making musical robots, talking robots. Then there were robots which were filling oil in lamps, okay, because normally human attendants had to do this all night. So here robots were doing that. And he mentions completely artificial gardens, okay, where everything looks lifelike but it's artificial. And one interesting thing here is that medieval travelers at that time, were foreign travelers. They also gave accounts. They had gone to Bhoja's court and to other courts nearby. So they said that we are seeing these things. So they are confirming this. And Bhoj, in addition, he also has a part, he has a chapter where he talks about experiments they were doing. They were actually trying to make planes. Okay, so these planes were basically made of light wood, they were bird shaped and they were powered by liquid mercury. And he mentions that we are being able to fly them for some distance. But he says that I won't give the entire technique here because the engineers who are making them are depending on this for their livelihood. So it's their trade secret. So
It's
this
also
is a
fact
like,
of their subsistence.
yes. So this is an amazingly innovative text.
So ma'am, uh, even like a couple of decades before, the world believed that the knowledge base or the knowledge systems of India is far fundamental or rudimentary as compared to the Western knowledge systems. But over the last 2 decades, things have evolved into a better sphere, in a better framework, that the world has started to believe that the Indian knowledge systems or Bharatiya Gyan Parampara has something different to offer or something more advanced to offer, though the methodology could have been different. But today we stand at a place wherein the entire world is looking back to us. So, what role has Sanskrit played in this perspective, like in continuing the continuing the tradition of knowledge exploration, and how has Sanskrit not evolved or not changed at all over the last thousands of years, like other languages? What is the reason why Sanskrit remains the same as it was practiced, spoken a few thousand years ago?
So I think you are asking two things, right? So one is you're asking that, how come this was not known earlier, that we had such a rich scientific tradition. Okay, so I'll first answer that part. So, part of it, I've already mentioned about the British conspiracy. So they basically stopped, all Sanskrit education because they stopped printing of Sanskrit books, and they were very dismissive of the scientific literature in Sanskrit. They never actually explored it, but we also never explored it because we believe the British, okay, and we could not access the text easily. And there was one more dimension here, okay. We always had a tradition in our stories of making stories interesting. We even tried to make history interesting. So as a result, we would never state the facts plainly. We would always add some details to make it more interesting, more memorable. So then after some time, people, they lost track of what really happened, what is a story. And just to give you some example of how this affects science, right? So I mentioned that even before Aryabhatta, they could even predict which day an eclipse will happen and the duration. Okay, but at the same time, we also had legends about Rahu and Ketu. So what the British chose to see is, they just chose to see the legends, and they said, look, these people don't even know why eclipses happen. And so we also thought so, and the reason, I mean, later Indians started thinking this. And the fact is, we were always very comfortable about having science coexist with stories. So we never felt that just because we now know the real reason, we have to stop these stories or we have to ban these stories. We never felt that need. But the British did not understand this, right? And so the later Indians also, they thought, okay, we only hear about the myths and we assume that we don't know the science. Okay, so that's one thing. And I think the second thing you were asking is, why does Sanskrit not change?
Yeah, its evolution as a continuous language. Unlike other language, even Shakespeare in English, we don't use it today.
Yeah.
Anyone who is in Shakespeare in English we don't understand what they're talking about.
Yeah.
But Sanskrit has not been like that. Whatever the the grammatical teachings were practiced so many years, thousands of years before, today also we have the same type of teaching.
Okay, so I would slightly disagree with that because, well, now for example, we know that the language of the IVC was also Sanskrit, and if that's another incentive, by the way, to learn Sanskrit. So when we see the content of the inscriptions, the Sanskrit there is much more archaic than the classical Sanskrit which we find in later books. Okay, and even the Sanskrit of the Vedas, it's in more detail. Like the inscriptions are very brief, right? So you have to make it even more cryptic. But the Veda has, poetry, so it's more detailed. But even its Sanskrit is quite different in a sense. The grammar is the same, but there were some archaic forms of grammar which Panini stopped using. Okay, but there was a grammarian before Panini, and his name was Yaskar. So Yaskar said that we actually need a dictionary to translate Vedic Sanskrit into current Sanskrit. Current means this was like maybe 7th or 8th century BC. So, and he said the reason is that many of us have forgotten what certain Vedic words mean. So he has a dictionary called the Nighantu. Yeah, for that. And then Panini, made a very nice, very scientific grammar. And then we have been following that grammar. So in classical Sanskrit, and that went on for many centuries. And after that, I think the vernacular languages evolved. So people, especially maybe after the 10th or 12th centuries, people were not really speaking that much in Sanskrit. Okay, so maybe that's why it did not evolve further after that.
So you spoke about Maharishi Panini,
Yeah.
and who gave to the world the Ashtadhyayi, which is a grammatical treatise to understand Sanskrit in a better way. And today we see that his Ashtadhyayi, which is mathematical or algorithmic in nature, it has given us a language that is suitable for programming, for computer sciences, and today for the artificial intelligence, that is the AI. So, do you think that Sanskrit could be in the near future a AI interferes language?
Okay, so I recently read an article, a journal article by Moole and Gonzalez. This was from 2024, and they said that Sanskrit is the best language for NLP, which means natural language processing. So, this is for communication between AI and humans. Okay, and they gave some reasons for it. So, the first reason was the Paninian grammar. So, the Paninian grammar is very famous for being very precise and exact, just like algorithms. So, it's very suitable for computers or for AI to understand. Now, the second reason is that in Sanskrit, the position of words in a sentence does not change the meaning. So, if you can change the position and the meaning will remain the same. So, this actually makes it easier for AI because if it helps AI understand. Right. Now, a third reason would be that Sanskrit is very highly phonetic. So, a phonetic language is spelled or written in the same way that it's pronounced. So, this makes it very easy to do speech to text conversions or text to speech conversions. Whereas, for example, we know that it can't happen with English. People are always complaining that in English we spell it one way and we have to say it in another way. Okay, so this is easy. Then the fourth thing is that in Sanskrit, ambiguous meanings are minimized. So a word can have more than one meaning in most languages. It can also happen in Sanskrit, but the extent of ambiguity is less. And this is nice for AI because AI usually have problems when the words can be interpreted differently because they cannot always understand context. Human beings can understand context. Okay, so these are some reasons why Sanskrit would be very good as an AI interface language. And in fact, ongoing research is being done on how to teach AI Sanskrit and later use them for translating other untranslated works in Sanskrit. And this is important because, for example, the National Mission of Manuscripts has 3 to 5 million manuscripts, which it hasn't had time to even edit, let alone translate. So the hope is that once we teach AI Sanskrit, AI can just draw on that knowledge and they can start mass translating these untranslated works.
That's a wonderful thing. If AI can do that,
Yeah.
then for the entire history of the Indian subcontinent, that moment is going to be the greatest so far, I think. So, quickly transcending 50 years, how do you see Sanskrit as an influential language in terms of governance, in terms of culture, technology, or education? Like, will Sanskrit still be relevant after 50 years? Because we are transcending, we are traveling in a world of AI starting from the previous couple of years. And now AI is fast growing as a tool for anything and everything. But not many know that Sanskrit is something which is behind that because of its algorithmic nature. So 50 years down the lane, how do you see Sanskrit?
Okay, well, what I can hope for is that we will be able to recreate the world of Sanskrit robot fiction where AI are speaking in Sanskrit, humans are also speaking in Sanskrit, and they are interacting with each other.
Your closing remarks for the day.
So I think we have many different reasons to learn Sanskrit. So one is to access its very rich, beautiful literature, and it's better to access Sanskrit literature rather than some other language because Sanskrit will actually tell us what our ancient society used to be like, and then it's helpful to us to also know our scientific achievements, and we'll be able to study the scientific texts better if we actually learn Sanskrit. And I've already given some reasons why just relying on translations is not a good idea. It can completely distort the meaning and it can create false narratives. And let's hope that Sanskrit is used widely in the future, especially for things like AI.
definitely we have discussed Sanskrit beyond politics, in fact,
Yes.
because your previous talk was on decoding of Indic civilization, decoding of the Indus script,
Mm.
which was Sanskrit,
Yes.
and then we also discussed about the the Dravidian politics associated with Sanskrit.
Mm.
But today we discussed so deep, in so much of deep about
Mm.
Sanskrit, the literary, the science aspect, history aspect.
Yeah.
So it was really great having a discussion with you on Sanskrit and its aspects. So thank you very much for having your time here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Namaste.